Tak a já nebudu zdržovat a jenom bych ráda uvedla našeho prvního hosta, a to sice slovinskou filozofku a překladatelku zabývající se politickou teorií, psychoanalýzou a etikou Jelicu Sumic Rihu. Jelica je mimo jiné představitelkou Lublaňské psychoanalytické školy a vydala knihy jako například Jedinečnost psychoanalýzy či Proměny etiky. A teď už předávám slovo jí, aby přednesla svoji přednášku nazvanou Filozofie jako vzdělání podle pravd.
I'm honored to take part in this highly interesting and promising and ambitious conference, and I would like to thank the organizers that made this conference possible, in particular Jana Berenkova, who invited me. And I look forward to the discussions that are going to be developed around all the papers that are going to be presented today and tomorrow. And now the question which I wish to address here in relation to Badiou's work is the extent to which it is possible to mobilize philosophy in the task of changing the world we live in. What is at stake here is nothing less than an examination of the possibility of philosophy in today's world. I will quote two philosophers, Adorno and Foucault, who, in a more or less direct way, broach this question. However, in examining the possibility of philosophy in today's world, Adorno and Foucault adopt two incompatible positions regarding the destiny of philosophy today. According to Adorno, and I quote from his negative dialectics, philosophy lives on because the moment to realize it was missed. End of quote. Although it seems that philosophy, by missing the moment of its realization, outlives its proper raison d'être, in a sense, it is still alive simply because it has forgotten to die, there is, according to Adorno, a way in which philosophy, despite this unrealized opportunity, can be responsibly practiced. At the end of Minima Moralia, Adorno links the survival of philosophy to its ability to, I quote, contemplate all things as they would present themselves from a standpoint of redemption, end of quote. What is remarkable about these two formulations is the way in which they bring together the redemptive function of philosophy and its survival. The point made by Adorno is not to merely acknowledge that philosophy has failed to realize itself this time. The point is rather that, due to its failure, philosophy seems to have also ruined the possibility of the world's redemption. Yet far from denying the irreparability of the missing opportunity, Adorno paradoxically insists that philosophy's survival depends on it. A peculiar survival, to be sure, as it entails that no second chance for redemption will present itself. But there is another reading of the task that philosophy assigns to philosophy in contemporary world. According to this reading, by missing the moment of its realization, philosophy seems to be returning to the point of departure, in a sense of speaking, to be once more nothing but the interpretation of the world. This is from Marx's 11th thesis. But in assuming its traditional role, philosophy nevertheless succeeds to embody a point of eccentricity or extimacy within the world, which allows it, by reopening a gap between the world as it is and the saved world, to maintain a critical distance vis-à-vis the world. For Foucault, by contrast, there is still work to be done by philosophy. If being modern requires a specific relation of belonging, such that presents itself as a task, as Foucault claims in his famous text, What is Enlightenment, then the task proper to philosophy, as it turns to its time, consists in marking the discontinuity of time by wrenching something eternal from the present instant. Only in this way, that is, by going against the grain of the times in order to rescue a moment of eternity in it, can philosophy heroize the present. This is Foucault's expression. A fundamental challenge to contemporary philosophy comes from the clash between these two incompatible tasks. But if the last hour philosophy has not yet come, this is because among contemporary thinkers there are at least two, Alain Badiou and Giorgio Agamben, who have risen to this challenge. Although neither Agamben nor Badiou never quite state this explicitly, it seems that they set out from the assumption that the only strategy adequate to the problem that philosophy must solve, namely the problem of its contemporaneity, is to stain the disjunctive tension between these two antinomian paths. For the lesson Badiou and Agamben draw from Adorno is that philosophy, considered as a form of resistance to the present, can exist after the proclamation of its end. And indeed, there is perhaps no better example of this desire for the continuation of philosophy than Badiou's attempt to refound philosophy in an epoch which is less hostile to philosophy than indifferent both to its existence and its non-existence. His audacious repetition of a Platonic gesture, a master's gesture if there is one, while redrawing the limits of its pertinence, succeeds nonetheless to establish philosophy as a genuine place of and for a thought that strives to transform the world by thinking about time-breaking novelties or eternal truths, as Badiou calls them. No doubt, in the intervening period, that is to say, since Adorno, a new relationship has been established between philosophy and its time. The novelty of this relationship can be seen in one of Badiou's lectures, whose title is precisely The Desire of Philosophy and the Contemporary World. In this lecture, Badiou dramatically announces that if, I quote, the destiny and even the very existence of philosophy is at stake today, end of quote, this is because in the contemporary world, described as a sort of anarchy or more or less regulated, more or less coded fluxes where money, products, and images are exchanged, end of quote, the place of philosophy seems to be foreclosed from the outset. It follows that in order to be able to resist the pressures of today's world, philosophy, according to Badiou, must be able to propose something which can interrupt this endless regime of circulation, disrupt precisely that which renders our world fragmentary and illegible. The imperative that contemporary philosophy confronts is that there be such an interruption point, precisely because only such a point of discontinuity allows thought to extract itself from the world that never ceases to change. Thus, in order to avoid the grip of the present hegemonic ideological discourse, philosophy's task is to return to a seemingly obsolete moment from the past, the real of the times, or a moment of eternity that transcends different times and worlds. Although Agamben has been slow to address the question of philosophy's tasks in our time, he agrees with Adorno and Badiou that it is philosophy's duty to resist the world and its time. Where Agamben and Badiou differ is over the identification of the task of philosophy. Agamben provides an alternative vision of philosophy's task, categorically different from Badiou's definition of philosophy's task, which consists, according to Badiou, in the recognition of a time-breaking novelty capable of causing radical reorientation of thinking and existence. Indeed, the only duty that philosophy is capable of fully assuming, according to Agamben, is to rescue, I quote, the capacity to remain faithful to that which having perpetually been forgotten, must remain unforgettable. End of quote. This is from Agamben's Time That Remains. It is in light of a threat of the return of the non-dead forgotten that Agamben conceives of exigency as a sort of protection, a prophylactic against the return of the forgotten, or more properly, against the return in the real of that which has been foreclosed from the symbolic. One of the most immediate consequences of this defense against the possible destructive return of the forgotten past is that the relation between the possible and the real must be rethought, or even inverted. Thus, against Leibniz, who stated that every possibility demands to exist to become real, the gist of exigency for Agamben lies in a retroactive production of the possibility of that which is presented to us in its immutable givenness and necessity. The exigency of restoring the unforgettable qua unforgettable thus necessarily implies a radical transformation of the past. For what is at stake here is nothing less than the exigency to restore the contingency of the past, or, in the words of Agamben, the redemption of what has been. This redemption consists in the restoration after the fact, retroactively, as it were, of the possibility of that which has already taken place in the past. This means that for Agamben, the possible does not precede reality, rather it follows it. At this point, Agamben surprisingly joins psychoanalysis, since salvation, as he sees it, instead of pointing towards the future, as one would expect, points towards the past. Agamben seeks to recover philosophy's redemptive function by introducing a new modality, that of exigency, to recover the possibility of the past. With Badiou, we have rather a different emphasis on the current time and therefore a different solution. For Badiou, if philosophy turns to past, this is not in order to save the past, its potentiality, virtual real, or real virtue, whatever terms one chooses in order to capture this agalmatic dimension of the past, which is agalmatic precisely because it did not succeed in passing into actuality. Rather, what determines the duty of philosophy is the question of extracting the eternal from the present. What philosophy strives to capture and clarify is the production of a new kind of the present, a paradoxical undertaking, as it is a matter of producing within the worldly present a new present, while relating to something that has already disappeared, namely the event. Taking up Hegel's metaphor of Minerva's owl that takes flight only at nightfall, in short, when all is said and done, Badiou claims that philosophy as such always comes after the fact. Indeed, by coming after, philosophy is constitutively anachronistic in its own time. This may explain why, for Badiou, the principal task of philosophy is to draw up a balance sheet of its own time. To think its time means, for Badiou, that philosophy has to detect points of interruption which mark a break with the previous paradigm of thinking, and, as a consequence, inaugurate a new time and start a new counting of time. More specifically, philosophy could be designated as an attempt to isolate, to extract the real of its time, or to paraphrase Badiou, literally wrench time from time, in order to reveal those unheard of possibilities of which time, because of the constraints of reality, did not know that it was capable, to identify those points at which the impossibility of a given time turns into a possibility of some unheard of novelty, allowing for a definitely new beginning. Philosophy, on this view, is a paradoxical turning towards its time, a turning which involves a curious torsion of the thought of time onto itself. We can find the most concise formulation of this torsion, this turning of time onto itself, this return to time of time to itself, precisely in the book consecrated to reflection on the 20th century. I quote, "For us, philosophers, the question is not what took place in the century, but what was thought in it. What was thought in the century that was previously unthought or even unthinkable. To be more precise, how the century taught its own thought, how it identified the thinking singularity in the relation it entertained with the historicity of its own thought, end of quote. But what becomes of philosophy as conditioned by its conditions in wordless times? How can philosophy continue to operate in accordance with the task it has set for itself without the possible overstepping of the limits imposed on it? No doubt there is no problem to theorize the present when something radically new takes place. It is, however, more difficult to extract something eternal from wordless times. Philosophy is normally supposed to come after its conditions. Yet this ordinary or normal task of philosophy seems to be particularly difficult to accomplish in periods in which nothing appears to be happening, in times in which no truth procedure seems to be active, in short, in eventless times. In such times, short of events, philosophy has to adopt a different stance towards its time. In the times when no new truth seems to be emerging, philosophy has to make a wager à la Pascal, namely that contemporary philosophy, and I quote from Logique du Monde, is capable of enveloping today's action and drawing strength tomorrow from what these actions will produce, end of quote. Paradoxically, it is precisely because the duty of philosophy is to think at the breach in time, in wordless times, when such a breach in time, a bifurcation of time, or the coexistence of two heterogeneous times, historical time and evental time, or the times of truth, is obliterated, practically invisible, to the point that the inhabitants of such a world are unable to even conceive of the possibility of another world, the role and importance of philosophy seems to increase. The difficulty that philosophy faces today is that precisely as the owl of Minerva, that is to say, coming after the event, it must prove that it can be also truly contemporary to its time. That is to say, capable of taking part, participating, together with its conditions, in bringing new truths to life. In such times, philosophy should propose, as a remedy for the current confusion and disorientation, a balance sheet of the time in which truth procedures have produced something new eternal truth. Philosophy presents itself today as a particular articulation or knotting of a balance sheet of the past and a manifesto enveloping the precarious present of the emerging novelties in a fiction of the future of this nascent present. Just like avant-garde's proclamations, philosophy today must provide formula, I quote from Badiou, to invent a future for the present, end of quote, of truths without being certain whether the thing itself is already present. In trying to be contemporary by being non-contemporary, the task of contemporary philosophers remain, and I quote from the century, to be of one's time through an unprecedented manner of not being in one's time, end of quote. At the same time, philosophy must show reserve. Its immediate goal is not to change the world, but our way of thinking. Ultimately, the task of philosophy today should be to strive, in the words of Badiou, for a revolution in mind, one that will help restore thought's capacity for action. In an interview with Le Magazine Littéraire, following the publication of his book, which was, as its very title signals, Le siècle, the century, conceived as a philosophical balance sheet of the past century, Badiou introduces a new, or at least a sketch of a new definition of philosophy's task in a striking and at the same time enigmatic fashion by stating that by definition philosophy comes after the fact, yet despite or more properly because of this, as philosophers, we also have, I quote, but the possibility to come before if we assume that by means of the categories that we forge, something of that of which we have been belated contemporaries is gathered together, brought back to life, end of quote. By transmitting to the younger generations something truly new that its time has produced, philosophy, although coming after, nevertheless tries to come before. In so doing, philosophy would change the disappearance into the possibility of an appearance, namely disappearance and appearance of a new eternal truth. By being intrinsically late, by coming after, that is, once the event that has inaugurated a truth procedure has already disappeared, i.e., by situating itself in this delay, lagging behind, philosophy is capable of wrenching, extracting from its own time something more in the times than time itself, the instant of eternity as the object A, a bit of the real that remains irreducible to chronological time. Yet the price to be paid by philosophy, insofar as it is true to its task, namely to identify the real of its time, is that its own gesture is displaced, eccentric, ultimately anachronistic in relation to its time. But it is precisely on the basis of this eccentricity, I would argue, that philosophical gesture of seizing truth is a paradoxical after that is at the same time before. Perhaps the most surprising short circuit can be found in a paradoxical cleavage of philosophy. Philosophy today is necessarily divided between a balance sheet and a manifesto, an announcement of the future orientation of thought. For the present to have a future, the question of the present must be posed in terms of a paradoxical obligation to the past. Now, how are we to understand this obligation to the past? For Badiou, whenever there is no present, when the present is lacking, this necessarily entails the lack of the past too. Yet, as Badiou never tires of reminding us, the concern of the obligation of the past is always the present and, by way of consequence, the future of this present. Badiou's thesis here is namely that with the obligation of the with the obliteration of the eventual past by means of its negation, obscuring, or criminalization, it is the present which also disappears. It is precisely at this point that the power of philosophy can and must be mobilized. Strictly speaking, for philosophy, this is Badiou's claim from his unpublished seminar, S'orienter dans la pensée, s'orienter dans l'existence, the 21st century has not yet truly begun. In view of this absence of new beginning, contemporary philosophy's duty is to uphold the following injunction. I quote, "The new century cannot indefinitely continue in deploying its vacuity. The new century must therefore finally begin." End of quote. As far as philosophy is concerned, for the new century to truly begin, it is necessary for philosophy to turn to the 20th century, namely to that century in which the possibility of another world was conceivable, and ask, what is still alive of the 20th century? Which novelties of the 20th century has brought about can be considered to be forever, immune to the change of the epoch? How, indeed, can we in the 21st century recover the passion of the real, this being precisely the effect that our century not only does not share with the past century, but tries to avoid at all costs? How can we return to the 20th century, the century of events, which is for us literally inconceivable? At this point, Badiou seems to be bringing together two, at first glance, contradictory theses. For the new century to finally begin, it is necessary for philosophy to turn to its proper time, to its actuality as it is, that is to say, presentless and wordless, a word of a deep confusion and disorientation, evidencing the very fact that for us, the 20th century, in its passion for the real, is completely incomprehensible. At the same time, the truths resulting from the eventual breaks in the 20th century constitute for Badiou the condition, moreover, an active condition for our transitional, eventless period. It is at this point that the question of transmission as a condition for the new beginning poses itself with all urgency. In what remains of my paper, I will try to argue that the issue of transmission of the past, of its restoration, is at the center of contemporary preoccupations with the possibility of a change of the world and mark a clean break with the past and project itself into the future, a change that would declare the advent of a new way of thinking and consequently of being. In the contrast to the 60s and 70s, when the question of the beginning could still animate philosophy, based on the conviction that thought itself is capable of orienting, if not of inaugurating a new beginning, the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century are marked by a loss of the belief in the very possibility of a new beginning. Today, we thus seem to be in a worse position than Mallarmé, who, after the defeat of the event of his time, the Paris Commune, declared, I quote, "There is no present, no, a present does not exist, unless the crowd declares itself," end of quote, and this is taken from Mallarmé's L'Action Restreinte. If we are to follow Badiou, Mallarmé could designate his time as an epoch without a present, to the extent that he established a direct nexus between the presence of the popular subjectivity on the scene of history and the production of the present. Thus, by referring the lack of the present to the absence of the crowd, that is, in Badiou's terms, by positing the eventual rupture as a condition for the presence of the present, Mallarmé announced the beginning of a less long period in which emancipatory politics is limited, that is, until the reappearance of the crowd, to restricted action. While Mallarmé's conclusion that there is no present because there is no event does not, however, exclude the possibility that in some unforeseeable future a new event might inaugurate the present that we lack today. For us, even this timid hope must be quenched. The prevailing opinion regarding the new beginning could be summed up as follows. Not only did nothing take place but the place, to borrow Mallarmé's celebrated formula, but more drastically, the current shortage of events, as Badiou puts it, the feeling that there are no more history-breaking events to be expected, is a clear sign that we are living in the times of the end of time, a time which excludes, by definition, the very possibility of something new taking place. The present time could then be designated as a time of amnesia, a peculiar amnesia to be sure, since we are not dealing here simply with the forgetting of some past events whose effects, as to paraphrase Lacan, have stopped being written in the present conjuncture. It is not merely about forgetting the forgotten. The amnesia of the amnesia is rather an anticipation of the amnesia, a readiness to forget in advance, a programmed amnesia, so to speak. Hence, for us, something is doomed to be forgotten even before it has actually taken place. This anticipated, programmed amnesia is namely the ability to wipe out not only what has happened, but to annihilate the very idea of the possibility for something to happen. In short, the ability to erase the possibility of the possible. The amnesia we know today is this ability to erase the possibility of the possible. What is crucial today, however, is not the question how to restore the traces of the forgotten past, but rather how to deactivate our readiness in advance to forget. Briefly put, how to intervene before this bifurcation of time takes place. It is precisely in the present conjecture of the amnesia of the possibility of another world that for Badiou, the articulation of philosophy's contemporaneity to the question of transmission has attained its central place. It is not a question here of merely bridging the temporal gap between the generation of the 60s and the present generation. What is at stake here is nothing less than the possibility of transmission under the circumstances of contemporary nihilism, namely a transmission from the evental generation, a generation that experienced in the 60s, if only for a brief moment, the possibility of a new beginning in the guise of a categorical departure from the existing state of affairs, to a properly nihilistic generation, which is marked not by the event, but by its absence. A generation that was literally marked by the nothing, a generation that was under the spell of the dominant ideology, according to which a new beginning is no longer possible. How then can the past beginning be inscribed in such a conjecture in which the gap separating the evental from the nihilistic generation seems to be unbridgeable? The question of transmission is the question of a singular relation to the times, or more properly, what is at issue in transmission is the restitution of the moment of the real that evades all integration into chronological time, into history. A moment of the real, I call it, precisely to the extent that the real is fundamentally transhistoric. That quality, namely, that is shared by eternal truth, those moments of the infinitization of the impossible possibilities of a given world, which are as such transworldly and transtemporal. In light of this transtemporality of the real, it could be said that the past, the present, and the future are less to be understood as chronological categories than as specific subjectivations of time. In this context, the current amnesia of the beginning could be viewed as a particular subjectivation of time, a mode of the subjective time characterized by the erasure of all discontinuity. This principal indistinction between a before and an after, that is at the core of the amnestic operation, produces a new temporal figure, that of the present without the future. The amnesia of the beginning, or rather of its possibility, is namely a subjectivation of time that denies the event as a clear-cut interruption by inscribing it back into history as one of the things that simply happen. By denying a discontinuity in which the eventness of the event consists, the amnesia of the amnesia is not only annihilates the past, but also the future. Not, of course, some abstract future, is to say, future taken in chronological terms, but the future of the very present, the future of its proper present. It is therefore not enough to say that for an amnestic subject, this being my name for Badiou's reactive subject, nothing has happened, that the past event is but an illusion. It would be more appropriate to say that for him nothing can happen. And it is only in this sense that it could be said that for an amnestic subject, there is not such a thing as a beginning or an event. In a sense, for such a subject, everything will go on as before. Things will not stop happening for him or for her, for that matter. But nothing will happen to him or to her, but nothing that will happen to him or to her could be considered as a clear-cut rupture capable of founding a new world and thus inaugurating a new time, a new historical epoch. How can a break, a rupture, be transmitted? What could be a transmission of the eventual rupture if such an encounter with the impossible real cannot be inscribed in experience, and would, for that reason, preclude all idea of a common denominator between a generation of rupture and a generation of amnesia, an experience which implies the affirmation of the irreducible distance between these two generations. How then is it possible to insist on the possibility, necessity even, of transmission? What can be the object of such a transmission if the emphasis is put on discontinuity rather than on continuity? Indeed, what is at issue in such transmission cannot be simply the establishment of the continuity between the past and the present. In contrast to history, which, in order to ensure temporal continuity, is precisely immune to all breaks, all discontinuity, such transmission aims at wrenching from the times something eternal, to use Foucault's expression, the present immanent eternity, which cannot be integrated into past or stored in the archives of memory. Ultimately, what such transmission brings to light is the moment when time is literally suspended, that impossible non-temporal instant before the bifurcation of time into a before and an after. To say this impossible non-temporal instant Badiou qualifies as the present without the presence. Here, the relation between transmission and the beginning, fundamental in the contemporary philosophy, becomes evident. Here, it also shows its political relevance. For Badiou, it is certain that the eventual rupture alone establishes the possibility of transmission. To be sure, for there to be a transmission at all, something must have taken place. The beginning is therefore a condition for transmission. Today, however, with the loss of faith in the very possibility of a new beginning, the causal relation between transmission and beginning is inverted. The inversion of the relationship between transmission and beginning has an implication at the level of the restoration of belief in the possibility of a new beginning. Indeed, one might argue that transmission today appears as a first step in the opening a space for the inscription of a new breach in time, a new beginning to come. From such a perspective, without constituting the sole condition of the possibility of a new beginning, transmission could nonetheless be considered an operation that opens up the possibility of the beginning precisely there where the beginning seems to be impossible. Amnesia and transmission are thus two drastically heterogeneous, ultimately mutually exclusive relations to the past and to time in general. While amnesia aims to reinscribe within history that which cannot be inscribed into it, an unforeseeable, non-derived interruption, transmission is forced to break with history in order to save something of the past, but in so doing, it secures the present for the sake of the future. Thank you.